Welcome back to Rachel Resets and part 2 of seeing how far $80 can stretch for one person. Here is day 2. The last video I had day 1. So this is starting off on breakfast, which we had a biscuit that we cut in half. We took one egg, scrambled it into our pan, add a little bit of salt and a little bit of cheese on top after I put it onto the biscuit. And here's breakfast. You can, of course, add some hash browns or something to the side if you wanted to. I like a lighter breakfast, so that was perfect for me. For lunch, I took one of those English muffins we had made in part 1 of this video and had that cut in half. It was already cut in half. It's easier to freeze if they're already pre-cut. That way you can take them out and they're just ready to go. I toasted them in the toaster oven and set on the plate an orange that I had peeled and a couple of carrot sticks. Now I'm just taking some of that chicken salad that we had made this last video and went ahead and spread that all over the halves of the English muffin, and then I'm going to sprinkle them with a little bit of mozzarella cheese, about maybe 2 tablespoons worth of mozzarella cheese. I popped both of those in the microwave for just a few seconds, just long enough to melt the cheese. I think it ended up being about 30 seconds. And then we have our beautiful lunch. This was really delicious and very filling thanks to all the protein in the chicken and the fresh fruit and veggies. Now onto dinner, we're making some sausage fried rice. I put a little bit of oil, about 2 tablespoons worth, into our pan. Then I have some of our pepper and onion mix, half a cup of our mixed vegetables. That was 1/4 cup of the pepper onion mix, and 1/4 cup as well of our pre-cooked sausage that we had frozen. I also have 2 of those half-cup servings of the rice, the brown rice that we had cooked up and frozen. I put those in frozen because I wanted to see how it would work out. It worked out all right, but honestly, I would have preheated it, heated up in the microwave for about 30 seconds to a minute just to help it thaw out. I added a dash of our garlic powder as well as a little bit of salt just to help season everything. That sausage also adds a lot of flavor, so that's really a good addition. I pulled all the rice and veggies to the side and cracked an egg in and then just kind of scrambled it in the pan. And once it was firm, I mixed it in with the rest of the rice and had that all well combined and then poured that onto my plate and dinner was served. I love using brown rice for fried rice just because it adds a nice chew to the dish and it just goes and complements everything really well, and it takes a lot for it to get mushy, so it ends up staying a really nice texture even though you are cooking it longer. So here's our dinner from day 2. Now we're on to day 3. I took those 2 waffles we had frozen as well, popped those into our toaster oven just to get a little bit of crunch back to them. I took a potato that I had washed and grated it down. I'm going to take the rest, put it in a little bit of water like this and microwave it just until it's cooked, and then we're going to put that half into the fridge and let it firm back up because I want to use that half for the next day. We're taking our hash browns that we just finished grating up, putting it into a pan that we had prepared with about 2 tablespoons of oil and gotten that nice and hot. I add a little bit of salt on top, and once it had crisped up on the bottom, I flipped it and let that all brown up really nicely, and here are our hash browns. The trick to hash browns, of course, is to not overmix it, otherwise you're just going to get soggy, oily potatoes instead of a nice crunch to them, or they'll steam instead of frying. Now I added a little bit of ketchup on top, took a little bit of margarine, put that onto our nicely toasted up waffles, and added a little bit of our fresh syrup that we had created in the last video in part 1. And I've got my tea on the side, and here is our breakfast. This may have been my favorite breakfast this week just because those potatoes really put it over the edge. They were just so crunchy and the perfect amount of flavor and salt, and it just complemented the waffles really well. So here's breakfast for day 3. For lunch on day 3, I decided to do some turkey Smashburger sliders. We have our 2 rolls, which I've cut in half, 1 mandarin orange, and some carrot sticks. For our burgers, we're putting 1/4 cup of our ground turkey meat, which I thawed, 1/4 cup of our onions that we had cut up and frozen, and about 1/8 teaspoon of our garlic powder, and just a dash of salt. I mixed all of this together. If I had thought about it, I probably could have put an egg and that would have helped these hold together a little better. but I didn't think of it, so I went ahead and just mashed these into our hot pan and let those brown up on both sides. Once one side was browned up, I flipped it and looked at the other side until it got browned up, and then I put those and set those aside onto a paper towel just to let the grease come off of it. Oh, and I nearly forgot to say, I took a little bit of mozzarella and stuck those on one side after I had browned it, just to let that melt all over the top. I also toasted our halves of our rolls into the pan until they were browned nicely. I took our mayonnaise that we had made in our last video and our ketchup, spread a liberal amount of mayonnaise on one of the sides, a little bit of ketchup. I also took a little bit of our lettuce that we had from our salad mix and just put a few little pieces of lettuce onto the bun underneath the ground turkey smash burgers, and here we have our sliders. These were really delicious. I enjoyed these, and they were very filling. Even though they're tiny sandwiches, since they have the protein in them, it just fills you up pretty well. And here is our lunch. For dinner on day 3, I decided to do a version of a chicken pot pie, but instead of chicken, we're going to be using the ground turkey. I put 1/3 cup of our onions, chopped onions, and 1/2 cup of our ground turkey into a pan and just let that saute together until the turkey had cooked fully. I added in a tablespoon of flour and stirred. Added a cup of our mixed veggies and a cup of water, as well as 1 chopped potato that I had washed, and let that stir and simmer together. I also added in a tablespoon of our chicken bouillon cube for a little extra flavor and for that salt that would be missing otherwise, to make it so it was cooking in a chicken broth mixture. Now while that cooked, I switched over to my bowl that I had set up to make a little bit of a pie crust mix using a cup of flour, 3 tablespoons of margarine, which I cut into that flour, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and 1/4 cup of cold water. I poured that in and then mixed it all together until I had a really pliable dough. This is going to be a fairly sticky dough still, but if it is sticking too much to surfaces, you can add a little bit of flour to your surfaces. I cut my dough in half, then cut 1/2 of those into 2 halves because we're making 2 turkey hot pockets for lunch for the next day as well, at the same time that we're making this turkey pot pie. With those 2/4 of the ball of dough, I rolled out each of those into kind of a rectangle shape, put on about 1/2 cup of the mixture from our turkey and veggie mix that we had cooked on the stove, and then flipped that ends over until they had sealed, and used a fork to further seal it and also to make a little bit of a scalloped edge. I had a pan on the side that I had put some parchment paper on, and I just flipped it over and flipped it onto that pan, and you can see I made a second one as well. With that half a dough ball, I rolled that into a really big round piece and put it into my little pie pan. This is about a 6-inch pie kind of dish. It's probably more meant for sauces or something like that, but I use it a lot for little personal pan pies just because I find it's about the right size. After flipping the pie crust into the bottom of the pan, I took the edges of the pie crust and just kind of rolled them on. You can make a little edge or a scallop or whatever you want to do with the edges, but I just wanted to keep it really simple and just kind of let it kind of curve over the top of the mixture. I had about 1.5 cups of that mixture left, and I poured all of that into the base of the pie. And we won't have a top for the pie, and that's part of why I wanted to have the edges of the pie crust kind of curve on top. At this point, I realized that both of my doughs were rather wet because they had stayed out, and the margarine in it doesn't like to stay firm outside of the fridge like a butter would. So I covered all of the different things. I put saran wrap over the entire thing and popped it into the fridge while I went and ran some errands. And then after about 2 hours, I came back, preheated my oven to 375. I took an egg, cracked it, and beat it up, and then brushed all of the pie crust with the egg. You'll see we have some egg left, so while those are in the oven for about 40 minutes, I decided to make some Snickerdoodles with some of our extra egg that we have left. For these, I took 3 tablespoons of margarine, a 1/4 cup of sugar, and 6 tablespoons of flour, as well as a tablespoon of egg, which you can see I'm really struggling. I should have poured it instead of trying to scoop it. Egg scooped is not a good time. So I poured or scooped 1 tablespoon worth of egg, as well as 1/8 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I mixed all of that well together until a dough had formed, and in a separate container I added a tablespoon of sugar, as well as I ended up adding 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon to get it as dark as I want. That's going to be the coating topping. I took a cookie scoop and just scooped in little balls into the container. You could of course use a bigger bowl than this little thing, but I ended up just going with it, and took my balls of dough after they had fully rolled into the sugar and pressed them a little bit, just slightly, onto our sheet, and baked them at 375 for 12 minutes. You can see they got very brown. That was because I put them on the bottom rack because my pie that was in the oven was cooking at the same time on the top rack, and I should have just waited until I had that top rack available. But they still turned out chewy and delicious and were the perfect sweet addition to my meals, as you could see. Now I still had some egg and some cinnamon sugar left, so I decided to make an orange marmalade loaf. I took 1/2 cup of flour, 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/8 teaspoon of salt, as well as 2 tablespoons of our orange marmalade that we had made in the last video. I didn't bother making sure these were exact measurements, but they were about 2 tablespoons worth, and added that into our bowl. I added in the remaining bit of our egg, which ended up being about 2 tablespoons. You see I get smart on the last one and finally pour it into my tablespoon. So here's about 2 tablespoons worth of our beaten egg. I added 1/4 teaspoon of vanilla extract, along with 2 tablespoons of our vegetable oil and a tablespoon of sugar. I mixed all this together and felt like it was way too thick, so I added 1/4 cup of our milk in. That was about the thickness I felt like it should be. I greased one of our small loaf pans. This is a 3x4 loaf pan with a little bit of margarine. Poured our batter into it, and then I wanted to make a little bit of a cinnamon sugar topping, so I took about 1/2 teaspoon of margarine, 1/2 teaspoon of flour, and along with that cinnamon sugar mix, which is about a teaspoon left, and just mix that together to make a little bit of a crumble topping. This sinks into it, not just tops it, so you're gonna have a little bit of a cinnamon swirl inside the bread. And this turned out really delicious. This isn't overly sweet, so if you're wanting something that's slightly sweet for a snack or to toast alongside with your breakfast in the morning, this was perfect. And now that it's been 40 minutes, our pie and our turnovers, our little hot pockets, are ready. Here is our ground turkey pot pie. This turned out really deliciously, and I actually think I might like it better with the ground turkey versus chicken, which surprised me. Now we're on to breakfast on day 4. I made a sausage, egg, and cheese biscuit, just having a little bit of ground sausage that I browned up, added it onto our biscuit. If you watched part 1, you saw me make all of my breakfasts in advance, and you know that I just took those biscuit sandwiches out of the fridge, took the biscuits, I popped the biscuit part in the toaster oven and heated up the egg and cheese part in the microwave, and then had that for breakfast every day, so I didn't have to make all of this the day of. I like to have breakfast prepared ahead of time, so this is just me recapping a little bit on my breakfast each time. So here's our sausage, egg, and cheese biscuit. Perfect addition for breakfast, along with a little bit of tea that we have on the side. For day 4's lunch, I had wrapped up these Hot Pockets, the ground turkey Hot Pockets, and these were delicious. I just microwaved them at work, and they turned out perfectly. You could, of course, put them back in a toaster oven and crisp up that shell a little bit more, but microwaving them was just fine as well. They won't be quite as crispy as fresh out of the oven, but still very delicious. Now on to day 4 dinner. I decided to make some pizza for this dinner. So I took a tablespoon of water, a tablespoon of tomato paste, a half a teaspoon of garlic powder, and a half a teaspoon of our Italian seasoning. I put a dash of salt and a fourth a teaspoon of sugar, mixed all that together to make a nice sauce for our pizza. I have our pizza crust, which we pre-baked slightly in the oven until it was just baked through but not very brown on the outside, and spread that into it. I didn't worry about heating it up or anything. It's cold from the fridge because it's been stored in there. I spread the mixture of the sauce onto the base of the pizza, and then I sprinkled on as much cheese as I wanted, which ended up being probably about a fourth to a third a cup of cheese. I then sprinkled over a fourth a cup of our pre-cooked sausage, crumbled sausage on top, and our pepper and onion mixture, and then added about 2 tablespoons more cheese on top just to help cover all the veggies and things and just help everything meld together nicely. I put a dash of our Italian seasoning on top and baked it 425 for 10 to 15 minutes until it had gotten as brown as I wanted it and the cheese had melted fully. And there we have dinner on day number 4. Sorry, I didn't get a cheese pull in this video, but I'll have to try to remember in the future. Now on to breakfast on day number 5. We're doing biscuits and gravy. We've got a tablespoon of crumbled cooked sausage, a teaspoon of flour, and a half a cup of milk, along with a pinch of salt and a pinch of garlic powder. We're just going to cook this until it's our desired thickness. If you're heating it up from storing it in the fridge, you'll want to add about 2 tablespoons of water and mix that in as you microwave it. That will just thin it out a little bit. And here's our toasted biscuits and gravy. Now for lunch, I knew I wanted to do something with tortillas, so I needed to make some. So I took a cup of flour, added it to a bowl along with a half a teaspoon of salt and a tablespoon of oil, as well as a fourth a cup of water. I mixed all of this until I had a really nice, soft, pliable dough. I took one larger ball of dough because I was making a burrito wrap for a later meal, rolled that out as large as I could, which ended up being quite large, and cooked that up onto my hot frying pan. I'm going to cook all of these all at the same time just because I know that tortillas freeze really well and I can keep these in the freezer as long as I need them throughout the week and they'll stay fresh. Here's what I ended up with as far as tortillas go. I have several small shells. I think it ended up being 6 of them, as well as one large burrito wrap for a later meal. I set all of these in the freezer after they had fully cooled off. I didn't end up putting parchment between them. I just let them cool fully and then pop them into a freezer bag, but you can of course put parchment between them if you're worried about them sticking together. Now for day 5 lunch, I decided to take some of those tortillas. I took 4 of them and I'm making some chicken quesadillas. We have an orange, as well as some of those carrot slices for our sides for lunch. I took about a teaspoon of margarine, as well as a fourth a cup of onions into my hot pan and started cooking that up until those onions were nice and caramelized. I set those aside and got to work on our quesadillas, which I greased the pan with a little bit of margarine. You can see it's a pretty hot pan. I added my quesadilla on the side, my tortilla onto the one side, added about 2 to 3 tablespoons of chicken that I had shredded up from that chicken we had set aside of our chicken legs that we cooked this last video. I added about 2 tablespoons or a half of the onions that we had caramelized, as well as 2 tablespoons worth of cheese, popped a top on top, an extra tortilla on top, and then flipped it once it had started getting brown and that cheese had melted fully. I did the same process for a second one and then cut them in half, and you can see we have 4 halves of chicken quesadillas here, and these were nice and cheesy, delicious, crisp, and just a great filling lunch. For dinner on day 5, we're making a roasted carrot and potato sheet pan dinner with meatloaf meatballs. We're going to be using our seasonings as well as about a cup of our ground turkey. I took 4 slices of bread from one of those loaves we had made and just kind of crushed them up after I had toasted them in the toaster oven. I made them as small as possible and then dumped them into my bowl along with a teaspoon of garlic powder, a teaspoon of Italian seasoning, and a half a teaspoon of salt. Mix that all together. Don't worry about if these aren't breadcrumb size, because they will work out just perfectly in the end. I added an egg, a fourth a cup of onions, which I had steamed and drained in the microwave just to make sure there wasn't a lot of water going into the mixture, a cup of our ground turkey along with a tablespoon of ketchup. I mixed it all well together and used a cookie scoop to make about 14 meatballs. I placed the meatballs on our parchment paper. I washed a potato, cut it into cubes, and peeled and cut off the ends of a carrot and cut that also into chunks. Then I added a tablespoon of oil, tossed all of that around in it, and added a half a teaspoon of garlic powder, a half a teaspoon of Italian seasoning, and a fourth of a teaspoon of salt. Mixed all of that together until it was all well combined and poured it out onto my pan. I made sure and spread it out so it was all in one layer so everything would get well roasted and toasted all the way through. Then I took some ketchup and spread little dollops of ketchup on top of each of those meatballs. I spread the ketchup mixture out with a spoon and then popped all of this into my preheated oven at 350 degrees for about 40 minutes. Until those meatballs were cooked all the way through and the potatoes and carrots were to my doneness level. And here we have our completed sheet pan meal. This one is very delicious and flavorful. I found that I could get 2 servings at least from it. In fact, one more serving worth of the meatballs after that. So I put 1 serving onto a plate, put another serving into the fridge for lunch the next day, and added 4 of those meatballs into a little Ziploc bag. We're going to do something with those later. For a serving, I decided about 5 meatballs was a serving. 10 out of 10 would make this again. This was delicious. Add a side salad with some French dressing on it. If you like, you can add a side salad to any of these meals and you're set for dinner. For day 6's breakfast, I took that half a potato that we had cooked and kept in that water in the fridge. It stayed white because we kept it in that water. If you take it off of the water, it's going to turn brown. And because we had that skin on top, we kept the skin on to keep it nice and light. I just pan fried these after I chopped them up in a little bit of oil and added a little bit of salt and set those aside. I took 2 of our pancakes from our freezer and popped those in the microwave just to help heat them up and heat them through. Then I took a little bit of margarine, put those on each of those, and then drizzled some of our homemade syrup on top. I also added a little bit of ketchup onto the top of those potatoes because I just think potatoes and ketchup go really well together. And here we have breakfast for day 6. I love pancakes for breakfast. It's what I ask for every year for my birthday. Now on day 6, I took my burrito out of the freezer, let that thaw. My big burrito shell that I had made, I took a little bit of our salad mixture from our salad that we had made, about half a cup worth, and put that onto our burrito. And we're taking the rest of our chicken salad and scooping that onto this. We're making a chicken salad wrap for lunch. I wrapped this all up all the way and then sliced it diagonally in half and added carrots and a little bit of orange. I think you probably could have guessed where I was going with the sides. I kept the sides simple and made the variety in the meals this week. Now for dinner on day 6, we're doing some white sauce sausage rotini. So we're adding in a fourth a cup of our cooked sausage and a tablespoon of our flour. The sausage still has a little bit of the oil on it, so that helped to soak up the flour and create a nice roux. Then we're slowly adding in a half a cup of milk. You can thin this mixture out if you start noticing it's getting too thick as you're cooking through everything, with a little bit of water or a little more milk if you feel like it. But I found like this ended up being the perfect amount. I took a cup of our rotini that we had pre-cooked to al dente in the freeze and then set in the freezer after it fully cooled off, and that's just going to make it so I don't have to worry about cooking it. It's already pre-cooked. I then added a fourth a teaspoon of chicken bouillon, a tablespoon of cheese, and a fourth a teaspoon of garlic powder into the mixture, and mixed everything until it was well combined. In a separate container, I steamed about 2/3 cup of broccoli in the microwave along with a little bit of our chicken bouillon cubed for some flavor on the broccoli, and here's our dinner. Breakfast on day 7 was our simplest yet. We have a biscuit, which I toasted up, and an egg, and we just add a little bit of salt onto our fried egg, pop that onto our biscuit, and we have a biscuit and egg, an egg biscuit. I did add a little mandarin orange on the side just to help bulk this meal up a little bit, and here is our breakfast. On to lunch. I decided to make some mini grilled cheeses and tomato soup using our little loaf of bread we had made in the last video. I took 2 tablespoons of tomato paste, added them to a pan along with a cup of water. You can double this recipe if you are wanting more soup, but I wanted a small bowl of soup, so we've got 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder, 1/4 teaspoon of Italian seasoning. I mixed all this together along with a dash of salt and just let that simmer in the back as I made the grilled cheeses. I added way too much oil into this pan, and which ended up being probably closer to 3 tablespoons instead of the 1 I was aiming for. Caramelized 1/4 cup of onions in that pan and set the onions aside. Then took my slices of bread, I took that loaf and had sliced it up, and added that into the pan along with a generous serving of cheese and a little bit of our caramelized onions, about a 1/2 tablespoon. I put a dash of garlic powder, a dash of Italian seasoning, and placed the bread on top. As you can see, the excessive oil made that bread really crisp up a lot faster than I thought it was, but I did better on the next one. Added my cheese onto the second one along with our herbs, the Italian seasoning and the garlic powder. I just put a little dash, I didn't really measure this, and the rest of our caramelized onions. I decided to make 2 small sandwiches to go with that tomato soup we're making in the back. By then the soup had heated all the way through. I poured that into a small bowl and put my sandwiches on the side. I topped the soup with a little bit of mozzarella cheese and just a dash of our Italian seasoning, and here's our lunch. You'll see that this sandwich got really nice and toasty and melted all the way through. Look at the cheese pull. Now on to dinner for day 7. I decided to do some chicken and dumplings. We're pouring 2 cups of water into our pot and letting that start to heat up as we add a tablespoon of chicken bouillon, a 1/2 teaspoon of garlic powder, and our whole cut up potato that we washed into the pot, along with a 1/2 cup of our mixed veggies that were from the freezer, and a 1/4 cup of chopped up chicken that is also reserved aside from that chicken that we roasted in the last video. Now in part 1 I had also made some biscuits, and I took some of the biscuit dough, cut it into chunks like this, and set it aside. I took half of those chunks that I had cut up and put them into my pot and let that simmer with the lid on without stirring for about 15 minutes. And now I have a beautiful bowl full of chicken and dumplings. I have been told by you all that the trick to chicken and dumplings is to cover it and let it alone and not over stir it, and you guys are definitely right about that. Now for the grocery haul you saw at the beginning of the video, it was $61.97. We've made 21 meals so far with that, which brings our total to $2.95 a meal. I think we can cut that down a lot further, so we will have a part 3 coming and continue seeing how far $80 will stretch for one person. Thanks for watching.